Great, thanks, Charlene. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today has been said already, which I think is a really great thing, but hopefully I'll be able to add some new details about particularly this study called, program of research called Well-Built for Wellbeing. You've seen this slide a couple of times already. This is the study that the University of Arizona Institute on Place and Wellbeing is spearheading with a company called Aclima, and it's funded by the General Services Administration, and they're very active partners in this research endeavor. So let me go ahead and get started here. So the purpose of this slide is not to go through and review all of the various inputs and outcome variables that have been done in this type of work that we're talking about, but rather just to show a couple of examples of what we're talking about and what kind of levels we're typically talking about. So some inputs that you may have already heard of from the speakers so far, and you will throughout the day, and certainly in the literature that's growing. Would be types of window views. What are you looking out to? Is it a mixture of sky, of nature? Is it built environment? Are there people? What about the daylighting? How much light is in there? We'll hear more about circadian light, exposure, and your rhythm. What about the acoustics? Is there nature in there? Which tasks are good to have a lot of noise? Is noise masking good or not? All these sorts of questions. Temperature, is it too high, too low? What about the different IEQ variables? And even what about the spatial syntax of an area? So what about the nodes and views that you have from your places of work, for instance? Those are some of the typical or some examples of some of the inputs that we see in these types of studies. And the outcome variables also vary a lot. So you might have some very objective cognitive tests, as we saw in the recent work done by Alan and colleagues with the CO2 and different VOC manipulations. Or you might see things like, I'll talk about a little bit later about heart rate variability. You've heard about that already. So other types of physiological variables, physical activity, and also different subjective things. So how are you feeling in the moment? How answering surveys about your psychological state. How comfortable are you? What mood are you in? And that obviously falls under a survey response, but there are many other survey responses that we're aware of. So the reason I'm bringing up all these here is to hammer home the point, really, that we're typically looking at one or two inputs and one or two outcome variables. We've heard a theme today, which is great, that we're talking about a system, that we're talking about synergy. That also means we're talking about interactions between variables. And you can only understand those things if you're measuring multiple variables at one time. So I won't go into this slide very deeply at all. You've already seen this as described by Esther Sternberg, but this is just a reminder about sort of how the current study that I'm going to be talking about today came to be. This is a big first step in that process. So this was the GSA Federal building in Denver, where they had two types of office spaces, and they only had environmental measures really that were one-time measures between the two things, and they didn't have real-time environmental data, and they didn't have real-time psychological responses other than a couple of questions, and not very wide array. They did have the physiological data. So back to this layer cake slide. The study, Well-Built for Wellbeing, or that program of research that I'm going to be talking about here, really does take a few of these layers within these broad categories and start to investigate their interactions. And interactions are a very important thing to study. So when I say interaction, I assume everyone always knows what I'm talking about, but typically that's not the case. So we have a broad audience here, and really, one way to talk about interaction is that you're not talking about, you're talking about something where the sum is different than, the total is different than the sum of the parts, right? Or a synergy or something like that. We're aware of literal interactions. If you have two drugs that interact in your system, that can be a bad thing, right? It's different than taking one and taking the other and adding those effects together. You can be talking about cognition and emotion interactions. You can't fully understand either without measuring both at the same time. Or you might be talking about something, an allele that you have and a number of stressors in predicting major depressive disorders. All these things are best understood by their interaction story, the synergy, the way that those things work together as a system. And it's best to look at things from a variety of layers. So we all have problems with certain things of those layers. So we have problems with surveys. We have problems with physiological measures. We have problems with the way we measure the environment. Each of those measures have pros and cons, but to just hone in on one and forget about the other important layers really does a disservice to the future of the research in this area. And it sounds like we're not on that track, which is wonderful. So I'm just going to give you a couple quick pictures here, description of where we are carrying out the research right now. It's all here in DC at 2 buildings primarily. Most of the subjects so far have been run at 1800 F Street, so that's the national headquarters for GSA. And then there's also the regional office building, which is just a little bit farther to the east. Both of these buildings are huge. We're talking like more than 500,000 usable square feet. They take up a city block, many floors. And what's interesting and useful for this study is that it's that 1800F and some parts of the regional office building have been undergoing a partial renovation. So there's a long-term renovation strategy for reconstruction and renovation for many of the spaces, if not all the spaces, within these large buildings. And right now, some wings have gone through different amounts of reconstruction or renovation than others. Some are brand new constructed wings. Some really haven't had any treatment at all, aside from maybe a little bit of paint and new furniture. So of course we see a variety of different HVAC systems, daylighting systems, and actually a new strategy of open seating with activity-based workplace spaces. So this is something where nobody has a reserved seat within the vast majority of 1800F, where we're doing where most subjects are coming from right now, and instead you reserve your seat online up to a week or two ahead of time, and you can also break out, go into a little quiet room to take a quick phone call based on the activity of your work in the moment, to get away from people, or to get away from noise, or to get away from them so you don't make noise. And then, so yeah, that's enough of that slide. So here's just some quick pictures. This is the outside of 1800F. You actually saw this picture before from, I think, Judy Herwegen's slides. This is from the south side of the building, and there are some infill wings that you see there. And these are both renderings, but the larger image on the right here actually shows what's been done already. So this is a new wing there with a lot of atrium space, a lot of natural daylighting, I should say, included in sort of the strategy for that renovation. So here's some variety of spaces. I'm not going to give you a tour of the entire building or describe where we are. That's not important for this talk, but just to show you the variety of spaces and different strategies implemented into making their workers more productive, or the intent is to do that. So here is a space where you can see the open work office, the open workstations here. Here you can see one of these little breakout rooms. So this might be called a quiet room or a focus room, where you can step into really quickly, carry out a small meeting, take a phone call, etc. There's a lot of wayfinding techniques used in this building. So we see color coding. We also see logo coding of different wings, so you can tell where you are, because it's a very big building and a lot of the areas would otherwise look very, very similar. And you've also probably seen this image before. This is a nice showing the nice view, as well as the daylighting. Each of the workstations are reservable, so every single seat you see in the building has a code, as do the conference centers and other rooms that you can reserve. Just more views of the atrium. So contrast a lot of those spaces, which are representative of more of the modern spaces, the more renovated spaces. We also see some of the older parts of the building without renovation. So here are some examples of corridors that have not been treated recently, and one of the sort of side pockets, which is a workstation room, off to one of those sides of those corridors. So here you actually see still this open workspace, but it's a much smaller square footage of area, and often the views here are not as good. So this one is a little extreme, but actually pretty representative for one side of the building, particularly on the ground level. And you see the air conditioner wall unit there. So clearly not a complete redoing of the HVAC system in this area. Luckily, we do have a little bit of, so you're probably wondering, what about cubicles? A lot of people work in cubicles, and certainly we need to find more areas where there are people working in cubicles. That a lot of people in the federal government work in cubicles throughout the nation. And there are some pockets in the regional office building that have some cubicle areas, and including some that don't have that are completely core. So these are typical reserved workstations. We have the great privilege of working with the company called Aclima from the Bay Area. They're a relatively new company, just came public this year. And this is called the Walnut, and this is really their sort of bread and butter. And this is what it's about this big, and what they do is they put them all over a building. So the intent is to get a network of these, an array of these nodes put up throughout a building to really understand how the building operates. So they measure a variety of things, and here are some of them listed here on the right. So things like you would expect, light, noise, temperature, relative humidity. Acceleration might be a little strange to see since they're mounted, but that can show you things about traffic or railroads or even earthquakes, or if someone's messing with the device. And then, so those are comfort parameters, things we're probably generally aware of. And then some other things that we're not necessarily as aware of, gases and particles. So there's a whole slew of VOCs, including and other things like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and a couple different filters for particulate matter. So we're talking about allergens, dust, that sort of thing. And so the strategy here at 1800F, this is a sort of an abstracted floor plan of 1800F. Again, you see the sort of color-coded wings, is to outfit the building as large as we can with these sensors to get a better understanding of where people are working, how the building is functioning according to all these different parameters and modalities. So with at the outset of the study, when you don't have the funding or the resources to outfit an entire city block with many levels, you have to focus in on a couple areas of interest. So that's a methodological concern. And so the first step of this study is really to hone in on a couple of problem areas based on past GSA surveys for where some of the better areas and worse areas are, and start there and then expand. So on the right, you see sort of a current layout of covering a wider range and getting an entire floor and getting all the types of spaces represented. Here are a couple of examples. They're pretty easy graphs to understand, so they're nice ones to sort of show to a broad audience. A couple of measures that people are very familiar with. So here's temperature. The time scale down there on the x-axis is about a week. So this is from a while ago, and it's just each line is a different wall node basically, and you're seeing peaks throughout the day. So each of those humps is basically a weekday, Monday through Friday, and then you see it sort of tail off on Saturday and Sunday. So you can probably guess what the outdoor environment is looking like right there, right? Easy to overlay with that information, as well as when people are in the buildings, a lot more activity. People make their own systems of creating heat. And you can get a story like that then you can overlap and overlay with other sorts of data. Here's one for sound. So this is just a straight decibel reading, and you can see pretty clearly what the sort of base level is for wherever these wall nodes were located throughout that same week. So pretty clear that there are 5 work days here. On some measures, you can see less on Monday and Friday because there are a lot of teleworkers at this building. But here, what might be interesting or of note is the wall node that you can see on the top there has sort of a 50 decibel baseline. So it's probably indicative of some sound masking or noise masking that's going on, being implemented in the building. So that's something of interest for sure. So going down the sort of that layer cake and looking at other methods that we're currently using, we've chosen a MovieSense device. So this is a company in Germany that creates one of these devices that measures activity, so full actigraph, accelerometer data, as well as your full EKG. So we're able to extract heart rate variability parameters, which is another word you've heard a few times today. So what we do in the study, since now we're talking about the participant level stuff, is we have them basically go about their normal work day 3 days in a row, and then also have them involved in the study 2 nights, so 3 days and 2 nights. They wear this the entire time. So this has a really nice battery, and people are able to wear it the entire time. So it's pretty small, as you can see, very lightweight. You can either attach it with a belt or with electrodes, as you see there. So why, again, do we do this? So what is heart rate variability? I think I want to spend just a couple seconds here and maybe say it in a new way. I know it took me a while to understand this. There are lots of different pieces to totally understand. And heart rate variability can be very, very complicated, but the idea of it is pretty simple. So as you heard Esther talk before, we have this fight-or-flight system. We evolved as a species to have a fight-or-flight system when we are threatened with survival. That's not usually very adaptive for the workplace. Yes, we don't want to be calm and asleep all the time. We also don't want to have that chronic level of stress all day long when you're preparing for something. You have a meeting with your boss, you have a deadline approaching, a stressful interaction with a colleague. You don't want to have that all the time. Stress is fine when it's in chunks, right? It's fine when you're on a treadmill. Your body's in a state of stress, but you recover from that. So heart rate variability gives us a way to, several actually lenses to look into that physiological stress response. So the way that we actually talk about heart rate variability or figure out heart rate variability on a very simple scale is the distance between those beats. So if you have a very regular heart beating exactly every second, 60 beats per minute, that would have zero variability in it. That wouldn't be a good thing physiologically. What you want is to see that variation, so you know that you have a different physiological system activated where your body's not preparing for fight or flight. So here you see an EKG sort of, abstract that has a little bit of variety between the distances between those peaks. So this would be indicative of higher state of well-being than something that was very, very regular. And like I said, there are very many different lenses into this stress response. There are dozens, but that's the basic idea. Here's another sort of messy graph, but this is a pretty simple thing as well. This is something that we share with our subjects after they participate, and this is just raw activity. So straight from the accelerometer data from their MoviSense device that they're wearing on their chest, we can extract this just activity data, give them some sort of guidelines for where's low to high activity levels, and they're able to see throughout those 3 days of participation or at night how much they're generally moving around. So they probably remember time they were working out, running to something, or sleeping. And then the last layer here is, so even further down sort of that, or on that lower level as well at the individual, is your psychological state. So what are people feeling that they're aware of? What are the subjective states that people are aware of? And what we're able to do for, or the strategy that we're using for this is a smartphone application that prompts them while they're at work, once per hour at random. We ask them some simple questions like where are you in the building, since we can't track them in the federal building. We ask them how productive and focused and on task they feel, a variety of emotions from the affective circumplex, from psychological literature to get their full emotional sort of state at that hour or mood. And also some questions about what kind of activities are they involved with, who are you talking to in the moment, what kind of work are you doing right now. We also have large intake and exit surveys, as you can imagine, but that's not exactly novel. And so this is basically my last slide, and while I'd love to share lots of data and findings with you, since we're talking about the methods here, we're really concentrating on that. We're working on the data right now, and hopefully in the next few months be able to start telling these stories and how these things are interacting to have an effect on people's physiological and psychological well-being. So again, we're taking the top level, we're getting the atmosphere, the chemicals, we're getting the environmental data around you. We're also getting the architectural features, what kinds of rooms are you in, what kind of light are you experiencing, and then of course the social individual, who are you interacting with, how are you feeling, and what are your physiological well-being indicators. And normally the acknowledgement slide is, passed on very quickly. I want to just take a second to go through just the logos on the side here, because the second logo down is our big data team, and it really does take a big data team or some team that is used to handling lots of types of data to tie together these disparate streams of data for really the first time to understand how the system works as a whole, and that is not an easy task to do. And then we have a team. Esther sort of talked about these too, but the next logo down is for a physiological team that helps process all that MoviSense data. And then, of course, thanks to ACLMA and the General Services Administration for being very active partners and colleagues in this endeavor. So, thank you.
Someone decides they want to drink coffee and so on. So how do you make that distinction where their activity is based on an external stimulus like coffee relative to physical attribute or things that's in that particular environment?
Right. It's incredibly messy, right? People are messy. They do a lot of things, and a lot of things are interacting in their system. So they might be stressed for a completely different reason than their environment. We're probably talking about low-level effects, but they're passive effects that over time add up to a lot, right? So the best way is to ask them the best questions we can without overloading them. So we do ask about coffee. We know that coffee intake, even when you vary it just as an intake question rather than every hour, gives you a lot of good information for controlling for that person's heart rate variability, because it does respond to caffeine, alcohol, smoking, things like that. But really, yeah, that's really the answer, is you ask as much as you can, and then you wait for that signal in the noise, because you need a lot of data to get that for these passive effects like this that are generally lower than, something extreme like you got into an accident or someone died in your family or something like that really caused that stress response, or something very, very positive. But that's really what we're looking for. Yep.
So just
Yep.
just a follow-up to that.
Sure.
So in case you do get that those sort of factors that might be compounding, what is your strategy to remove those? So is it like all or none sort of thing to remove the compounding effect, or would you introduce a number to account, say, for that particular factor's contribution?
So the current data model is a pretty simple hierarchical linear model that we're using, that the big data team uses, but they have a bunch of other models that I'm not going to pretend to fully understand, using different Bayesian things and tree models to try to see which factors are most important. And as you probably know, if you throw everything into the model, that's great for an insurance agent in predicting an outcome, but it doesn't tell you much about the important mechanisms for change. And since we're interested in what are the most important variables of change that you can manipulate and then get out. So even if a couple of things overlap, a lot, you're only able to see the unique influence of each one, that's not always the best model for this kind of study. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question much at all, but those are the strategies that we're using so far. Yep.
Maybe a question for Will at GSA.
Mhm.
How do you handle the whole process of requesting battery release?
You mean like the example photo? So there are a couple different agencies that we have to go through for making sure everything is acceptable. So the GSA has their own internal process, and then the University of Arizona has their IRB, their review board. And so everything is it's a little more careful, I would say, than the usual study that we would go through for anonymity. But people are signed anonymous emails. Everything, their name isn't on anything but a consent form, and nothing is tied to the data. So showing or sharing a participant's data with them like that is completely anonymous. We should probably, yeah.
Let's go through the whole panel, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards.
Great. Thank you.